A killer that hunts children is probably the most terrible thing on the planet already, but one that only hunts during the winter months and feeds and bathes the children for days, sometimes weeks, only to kill them? Well, now, that's another level of horror. For 2 years, this is the hell that Chicago faced in the 70s, and this is Evidence Obscured, the team that brings you the most unusual, gruesome, and downright hair-raising cases from around the world. If that's the kind of thing that scratches your true crime itch, you've come to the right place. Like, subscribe, and let's dive into the nitty-gritties of Chicago's most infamous child killer. Let's get into it. I need to clear up a discrepancy before we even begin. There were a few deaths of children in the years leading up to the Oakland County child murders. The whole of Chicago was in a state of panic long before the child murders began, so their paranoia is understandable. Most coverages include these deaths into the bunch, but they've since been disproved, and there have been convictions. But most headlines at the time also grouped them in, so the public were also under the impression that they were connected.
Since January 1st, 2 teenage girls have been found murdered while babysitting. Could these deaths have been prevented? Are there precautions?
In 1976, 2 girls who were babysitting were abducted and killed out of the homes they were minding. 16-year-old Judy Farrow and Sheila Schrock, just 14 years old, were murdered in separate incidents. Cynthia Ray Cindy Caju, 16, was abducted, assaulted, and killed by 3 men when she accepted a ride from them. 2 of the men were convicted, and the other died before he could be arrested. So you can kind of see why people thought the babysitters and the later child murders were all connected at first. People were scared. Chicago knows crime. It knows violence since its founding. But these murders weren't happening in the expected low-income hubs where drugs and organized crime ruled the streets. They were happening in safe, middle-class neighborhoods where kids walked to school and rode their bikes to the store. That brings us to February the 15th, 1976, when the child killings truly began. 12-year-old Mark Stebbins went to the American Legion Hall where they were showing a war movie for the kids. He, like many other children, made use of the facility often, so that wasn't unusual. He called home at 1:30 that afternoon, telling his mother that he was on his way home. The walk was only half a mile, so when he didn't return in an hour, Ruth Stebbins became worried. She drove around Ferndale, called up friends, and by 11 that evening, she reported Mark missing. Somehow, he'd vanished walking home in a straight line on a relatively busy street where cars and shopgoers hadn't seen anything suspicious. 4 days later, a man walking to the pharmacy at around 10 in the morning passed a heap of snow where Mark Stebbins' body was displayed against the wall of a parking lot. He was fully dressed, his arms folded neatly over his chest, and he had no discernible injuries on his body. The autopsy revealed that Mark had 2 lacerations on the left side of his head and a bruised ear. The wounds looked like they'd been made by the butt of a shotgun. He'd been assaulted with a foreign object of some kind, and his cause of death was that he'd been smothered to death. Everything indicated that Mark had been held captive for the past 4 days. There were bruising around his ankles and wrists from some kind of restraint. His clothes were soiled with fecal matter and sweat, indicating that he'd been wearing them for all those 4 days, and the only trace evidence on him were golden carpet fibers on his socks. His jacket, however, was freshly laundered. He also had food in his digestive tract, so Mark was at least cared for to some degree throughout his ordeal. For a few months, Chicago forgot all about Mark's death. The police had no leads, so the papers had no stories, but the killer hadn't moved on at all. In December, when winter was again cloaked over the city, 12-year-old Jill Robinson disappeared from Royal Oak just 3 days before Christmas. Jill had a fight with her mother over helping with dinner. When her mother told her to go stand outside until she felt that she wanted to be part of the family again, Jill threw a backpack over her shoulder, got her bike, and rode over to her father's house that was 4 miles away. Come to think of it, I tried this stunt when I was 10. Yeah, I learned real quick that my mother, armed with a wooden spoon, was a monster more terrifying than anything that horror movies could think of. Never did that again, let me tell you. Anyway, Jill definitely made it to a hobby store halfway between her father and mother's houses. We know this because some kids found her bike behind the store, rode it for a few blocks, and ditched it when they were done. It's assumed that the hobby store was the site of her abduction. She was reported missing that same night and remained so for 3 days. One day after Christmas, Jill's present stood unopened under the tree, and the driver spotted a blotch of red snow on the side of Interstate 75 in Troy, 6 miles away from home on one of the busiest interstates in Chicago. Jill's fully clothed body, still wearing her backpack, was identified. The left side of Jill's face was blasted away by a shotgun, fired at close range. There was food in her stomach. She showed no signs of sexual assault, given that she had a feminine hygiene product inside of her vaginal cavity was intact and still placed correctly. She'd been bathed and cared for and showed no signs of any other physical trauma, not even bruising that would indicate restraints. Her nails were scraped clean and there were golden carpet fibers on her socks, but not her shoes. So Jill was held captive, but she was not abused or restrained in any way like Mark had been. Her backpack still had all of her possessions inside except for 2 books that she'd packed. The killer kept those as souvenirs. Police figured that the killer had avoided assaulting Jill because she was menstruating. But then why keep her captive for 3 days then? They also didn't rule out that she was smothered. Jill was found lying on her back with her backpack pressing against her from behind. It's possible that the killer smothered her, transported her to the location, and when he put her on the ground, the backpack forced air out of her lungs, stimulating her vocal cords. This would have made it sound like she was moaning. The angle of the rifle, the position of the body, and the blood pool did line up with Jill being shot where she lay while the killer stood over her. He probably thought she was alive and made absolutely sure that she would be entirely dead before he left. And again, the area was extremely well traveled, so he was making sure that the victim was going to be found. Only one witness reported that he'd seen a dark Pontiac Le Mans with some damage to the taillight pulled over on the side of the road in the general area. He was a very reliable witness since he owned the exact model of car himself. Police didn't find anything at the scene, and they barely had a chance to clear the road before the next child vanished. A week later, on the 2nd of January 1977, 10-year-old Christine Marie Mihelich disappeared when she walked 3 blocks from her home to the 7-Eleven in Berkeley. Christine chatted to a co-worker of her mother's outside the store, went inside to buy a teen magazine, a soda, and some candy, and then Christine vanished into thin air. This time, the public response was enormous. Kids were chaperoned to and from school. They never went out alone. Tens went around door to door to collect funds. The family hoped that the kidnapper would demand a ransom. That's how dire this was. Their best hope was that large sums of money would save their daughter, unlike the other babies that weren't so lucky.
And terrified. It's a terrible way to live, I think. I'm very saddened because children just, you're afraid to let them have any freedom anymore. And most of all, I'm upset because my children are very frightened and don't want to be outside alone anymore and won't come to school alone. And I think that's the worst thing to grow up, being distrusting.
I only live 2 blocks from the school, but I fear even that short distance for his protection with what's been going on in our community.
What is your children's reaction? Are they afraid, or do they know really what's going on?
I don't think they really understand. They know the boys are missing, but I haven't made it scary.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion, everybody's keeping their eyes open.
So the kids are really scared, huh?
Yeah, if a car stops in front of them, they'll start running because they don't want to get kidnapped.
I know my kids aren't playing out. They're with me all the time.
But the days turned into weeks. No ransom, no tips, and every search of Chicago's wooded areas, parking lots, and alleyways turned up empty. Most likely, the city's high-alert tensions kept the killer from moving out in public. He was patient, waiting until the searches cooled off and families weren't as vigilant before he surfaced again. The perpetrator's caution was evident when Christine's body was discovered in Franklin Village, a new neighborhood that was reasonably underdeveloped and that had very little traffic. 19 days after her abduction, Christine was found lying in a shallow ditch beside the road. Her hands neatly folded over her chest. Her clothes had been laundered. She'd been bathed and fed. She'd definitely been kept alive for the entirety of her captivity because the autopsy revealed that she'd been smothered only 24 hours before she was found. Christine had no injuries, was not sexually assaulted, and had no ligature marks on her wrists or ankles. The only 2 clues around the crime scene was a set of impressions and the same golden fibers on her socks. The tire impressions did match the dimensions of a Pontiac Le Mans, like the witness in Jill's crime scene had reported. It was a month of crickets after that before the next child went missing. 11-year-old Timothy John King left his home in Birmingham on his skateboard and went to a pharmacy on the evening of March 16, 1977, 2 months after Christine's murder. When he disappeared, Chicago was sent into an absolute frenzy all over again. This time, police got a break. A woman loading groceries into her car saw Timmy, holding his skateboard, talking to a man in his late 20s who stood next to a blue AMC Gremlin. He had a tanned complexion, mutton chops, and shaggy dark hair. She left the parking lot without thinking much about the interaction until she saw the news that night. Another woman came forward to claim the blue Gremlin, so the car was a dead end, while another man came forward claiming to have seen an overweight middle-aged man in the parking lot around the same time that Timmy disappeared. He was driving a dark Pontiac Le Mans and was watching the interaction between Timmy and the mutton-chopped younger man in the Gremlin. If you remember, a dark Pontiac Le Mans was spotted near Jill's body too, and this witness was just as reliable as the first. He was an automobile designer by trade, so he had the know-how to spot a model, type, and year a mile away. Finally, they had a description, even if it was 2 separate possible suspects, but it was still a huge development. He returned Timmy 6 days later, unfortunately not alive, in another shallow ditch located on Gill Road in Livonia. He was groomed, laundered, and fed, and he'd been smothered just 6 hours before a group of teenagers found him. Like Mark, he'd been assaulted with a foreign object that left no forensic trace. He'd been bound by the ankles and wrists, and his final meal was KFC, which just so happened to be his favorite thing to eat. His skateboard was dumped a few feet away from his body. Timothy's body was still so warm that paramedics tried to revive him at the scene, probably destroying any potential evidence in their desperate efforts to bring him back to life. The killer had been in a hurry. He hadn't posed Timmy like he'd done the others. It looked like he'd thrown the boy and the skateboard out of the car as fast as he could. All that could be isolated was that Timmy had been washed with medical-grade soap and that he had golden fibers on his socks too. Unfortunately, in my opinion at least, police spent a great deal of resources searching for the Gremlin and the man with the mutton chops, instead of putting all of their attention on finding the Pontiac that was driven by an older man who'd been linked to 3 separate crime scenes out of the 4 murders. Despite 14,000 tips and the largest task force in United States history at the time, the case went cold. The killer disappeared after this, probably driven underground by the enormous amount of attention during the last abduction, not to mention 2 separate sketches, one of which was probably him. My money is on the overweight older man and the dark Pontiac Le Mans. Now, there have been many cases that were theorized to be linked to the Oakland County child killings, most of which I disagree were related. Seriously, the sheer amount of brutal child killings in the 70s is hair-raising. I've excluded those who were not between the ages of 9 and 13 and the ones that have arrests, those that were not smothered or strangled, and the ones that did not match the methods of disposal. This killer had a clear routine: abduct a child, hold them captive, clean and feed them, and then he very personally killed them by smothering them to death. He wanted the victims to be found, and he did not target children unless they were alone. He did not prefer one gender over the other, but he did treat them differently. Only the boys were subjected to restraints. The girls were not. The only matches to these criteria are the disappearances of 12-year-old Kimberly Alice King, who disappeared from Warren on September 15, 1979. Kimberly's case remains unsolved, and her body has never been found. There were 2 pieces of evidence that police never fleshed out. First was that a single hair was found on Timothy King's body. The DNA has been sequenced, and a few predators of children and murderers were looked into. They even exhumed a serial killer with the hopes of finding a match, but no match has been found yet. Given the contamination at Timmy's crime scene, it's possible that the hair came from one of the paramedics or officers. Secondly, the girls might have been assaulted after all. All news reports made a point of stating that they weren't, but later, police reports admitted that semen was found on Christine's body, and they clearly stated that the girls' injuries would not be disclosed to the public. There's no mention of where those samples are now, or if they've been run through the system, or even why this information would have been kept concealed. Wherever this case stands now, Police aren't giving up much information, but I highly doubt that a person with perversions as evil as these would truly go into hiding. He was patient and put a great deal of planning into his abductions and murders. It's all but certain that he moved to a different city, a different state, and just changed his MO to avoid detection. This is one killer that makes my blood run cold. Unless he was miraculously charged with an unrelated crime and ended up in jail, he probably went on to kill kids for decades more. How many babies were taken, held, and tortured during these past 40 years, all because he slipped out of police's fingers? I don't know about you, but that thought is enough to keep me up at night. See you in the next one, people.